This talk, like yesterday's talk, is about 15 double-spaced pages and should last about 35, 40 minutes. I think you made it in the German university world of the 19th century if you could write a book that had a title that began with Prolegomenon zu. So I think I'm writing a kind of prolegomenon to Jewish ethics. That is, this is much more philosophical, conceptual, methodological than substantive. But I think Jewish ethics is a contested concept, so that's what I'm going to try to address in this talk. Jewish ethics is a problematic concept. I want to make it clear, it's not because Jews are unethical, at least more than anybody else. It's that the idea has a lot of built-in problems. Although it seems clear enough at first glance, it is controversial. One can find textbooks which describe the ethical aspects of Judaism alongside the ethics of other world religions. The authors assume that the term ethics picks out relevant normative features of the Jewish textual inheritance, and that these form a substantial field within Jewish thought. They assume that Jewish ethics is fully comparable to Christian ethics, that these are meaningful and fruitful terms. From an internal Jewish point of view, however, matters are not so straightforward. Part of the problem is methodological. Should concepts that are at home in one universe of discourse, say Western philosophy or Christian theology, apply without qualification to another religious cultural tradition, such as Judaism? Shouldn't one try to constitute the category of ethics from within the horizon of the religious tradition itself? Whether we come from the outside or the inside, in the case of Jewish ethics, there are several methodological concerns. Call the first one the Rationality Concern. What is the role of reason in the constitution of ethics? For Aristotle, ethics implies that reason, reflecting on custom, purifies opinions and identifies the best life for human beings, the virtues of character that pertain to the best life, and the right actions in relevant circumstances. Human reason can get us to correct conduct and excellent character. It can disclose the virtues and prescribe how we should cultivate them. Reason points toward the life to which we should aspire. The problem is that the sufficiency of human reason, exemplified by Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, does not comport well with Judaism's theistic approach to human life, character, and conduct. As the prophet Micah put it, "He has told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice and love goodness and to walk modestly with your God." For the prophet, God speaks. The moral truths of doing justice and loving goodness may substantively overlap with a rational ethics, but the source is not reason as such, but divine teaching. What difference does this make? The 20th century Jewish thinker, Abraham Joshua Heschel, wrote that while philosophy speaks of the good, Judaism aims at something higher, the holy. Is Judaism's focus on holiness isomorphic with the ethical vision of the good? Are the differences merely semantic, or are there substantive issues in play? Surely one issue in play is the role of revelation in ethics. Whereas Greek philosophy has no need of the concept, in Judaism it seems to be central. What is the role of God vis-a-vis ethics, and how does that affect the role of reason? A related issue is what we might call the particularity concern. Plato's form of the good plays a role similar to that of God, but the good is not God, not the God of Israel at any rate. The God of Israel is a person who enters into a relationship with a people. The relationship is called a covenant, brit. How does the covenantal relationship between the people Israel and God affect ethics? if the framework for Jewish moral life is the covenant in its historical and existential particularity, then Jewish ethics is not universal. The term names at most norms that are embedded in a specific way of life. As we moderns use the term ethics, however, it points to something universal, something beyond the mores of a particular community. To say that gratuitous killing is wrong says more than it is wrong for our tribe. It is universally wrong. If universality is an important feature of genuine ethical norms, how do Jews reach it, if they do, within a covenantal framework? Furthermore, if norms are truly universal, why would one need a covenantal framework? Wouldn't ethics transcend and dispose of particularity? A third concern is that Judaism, like Islam, but unlike Christianity, puts religious law, halakha, at the center of its prescribed way of life. Call this the legal concern. Although the term law is too narrow to capture the traditional mode of Jewish life, it is not wrong to use it. Judaism, as developed by the ancient sages, whom we call rabbis, is based on the interpretation of biblical commandments, mitzvot. The rabbis identified 613 commandments in Scripture. Their generations-long hermeneutical project of specifying how to implement these commandments constitutes the Judaism of the oral Torah, the ancient rabbinic term for how written Scripture should be understood and enacted. The centrality of law complicates the status of ethics. Is there an independent dimension of normative thought about conduct and character which is not reducible to law? Or does law per se have ethical elements in it and can therefore serve as the comprehensive conceptual framework? One consequence of this choice is that if ethics is independent of law, it can criticize and correct law. If ethics is a subsidiary aspect of law, it is less clear whether it can have its own critical voice. In general, Jewish traditionalists in our time opt for the supremacy of law. They tend to see ethics as a dimension of halakha. Jewish modernists go in the opposite direction and grant Jewish ethics supremacy, or at least a controlling perspective on halakha. So this generates a fourth concern about the modernist valorization of ethics at the expense of the comprehensive, pre-modern, halachic way of life. Call this the assimilationist concern. The late Jewish philosopher Michael Visegrad wrote in his provocative theological work, The Body of Faith, that, quote, ethics is the Judaism of the assimilated, end quote. Visegrad intended to critique the modern Jewish emphasis on ethics as what used to be called here in Germany in the late 19th, early 20th century, das Wesen des Judentums, the essence of Judaism. Visegrad rejects that ethics is the essence of Judaism. It's the Judaism of the assimilated. Visegrad had in mind developments like Reform Judaism and thinkers like the 19th century psychologist-philosopher Moritz Lazarus, author of Die Ethik des Judentums, 1898, and his famous critic Hermann Cohen, the founder of Marburg Neo-Kantianism. Lazarus' book was the first modern systematic effort to interpret biblical and rabbinic Judaism entirely within an ethical framework. Cohen's posthumous masterpiece, Religion der Vernunft aus den Quellen des Judentums, is a comprehensive moral philosophy of Judaism. It interprets Jewish ritual, law, and theology as aspects of what is truly essential, the ethical relationships between human beings. For Cohen, the ethical life is the essence of Judaism. The correlation, Cohen's term for the relationship between God and humans, is a matter of infinite ethical striving toward imitatio Dei. From Visegrad's perspective, these works and the religious orientation that they underwrite are systemic distortions of Judaism. They represent a deracinated Judaism remodeled along Enlightenment lines designed to aid Jewish acculturation and acceptance into Western European society. It is not that Judaism does not have profound and constitutive ethical elements. Visegrad certainly thinks it does. It is that these elements are elevated to the dominant framework of Judaism that he finds problematic. In this essay, I'll respond to some of these concerns, but due to time constraints and extensive consideration, must await the final paper. Now, let me talk about rationality first. In the fifth book of Moses, book of Deuteronomy, Moses portrays God as enjoining commandments on the Israelites. Moses charges the Israelites, if they obey God's commandments punctiliously, not adding to or subtracting from them, the nations of the earth will recognize the Israelites to be exemplary. That is, they'll recognize the excellence of Israel's law and admire their devotion to it. Quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 4, "And now, Israel, give heed to the laws and rules I am instructing you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. You shall not add anything to what I command you or take anything away from it, but keep the commands of your God, the Lord, that I enjoin upon you. Observe them faithfully, for that will be the proof of your wisdom and discernment to other peoples, who on hearing of all these laws will say, surely that great nation is a wise and discerning people." This text presents God, literally Moses, as giving Israel God's laws in the form of commandments. Moses is reiterating God's commandments. God and Israel are in a covenantal relationship begun at Mount Sinai, when Israel accepted God's kingship and pledged to do what God expected and to hearken, to listen attentively to his word. The relationship is unique and particular, but the laws themselves are intelligible or rational enough so that those outside of the covenant can see their merit. This text became a touchstone for the cross-cultural intelligibility and positive value of Israel's laws in the eyes of those Jewish interpreters who believed that Jewish law was fundamentally rational. So what role does God play here? Clearly, God speaks. God communicates the law to his people. But more fundamentally, do the commandments that make up the law, such injunctions as honor your father and your mother, love your neighbor as yourself, have the authority of law because God commands them, or does God command them because they are good? Students of ethics will recognize a version of the Euthyphro Dilemma in these questions. God commands, but does that imply what in the history of ethics has been called divine command theory or divine command morality? The strong version of divine command theory holds that God is the source of moral norms, such that A, without divine command, there would be no morality. B, whatever is moral only because God wills it. And thus C, the notorious implication that if God were to will something that seems immoral to us, such as murder, it would have to be moral. If the strong version of divine command morality held for Judaism, the rationality of the commandments would be minimal. If we could even use the term Jewish ethics, we'd use it equivocally at best. The biblical story of Abraham relates a shocking incident that gives support to a strong version of the divine command theory. Abraham is told to take his son, his only son, Isaac, and to bring him, quote, to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I, God, will point out to you, end quote. Although the ancient rabbinic commentary known as Midrash puts words of resistance in Abraham's mouth, the Bible depicts his immediate compliance with God's will. Kierkegaard takes this as the suspension for higher purposes of ethics. Although Jewish sources typically disdain a clash between something presumptively higher and ethics, the text can plausibly be read that way. the text can give support to the idea that the highest morality is the command of a supra-rational divine will. Morality, quote unquote, need not correspond with what seems morally right to us. Directly opposed to this, however, is a story from an earlier time in Abraham's life, the famous dialogue between Abraham and God in Genesis chapter 18. God reveals to Abraham that he's going to destroy the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham senses a great potential injustice. Surely there must be some righteous people in the cities. How could it be just to destroy the righteous along with the wicked? Abraham challenges God. Far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? God and Abraham then engaged in a dialogue about how many righteous people it would take to spare the cities, with God agreeing to as few as 10. As it turned out, of course, there were not even 10 righteous souls, and God destroyed the cities. This dialogue reveals that some sense of justice, some standards of just conduct, exist independently of divine command. If God's decision to destroy the cities was exhaustive of morality, Abraham would have no moral ground on which to challenge the judge of all the earth. Abraham's challenge assumes a standard which both God and he can recognize and to which he can appeal. One can see how, at the level of narrative, the Bible generates its own Euthyphro Dilemma. The most typical Jewish approach to the role of God vis-a-vis ethical normativity has been a weak version of divine command theory. The strong divine command theorist believes that divine command determines morality. On the weaker version, God commands the law because its norms are intrinsically good. The weak divine command theorist believes that God reveals what, independently of these commands, is morally correct. The role of God in communicating and commanding the law is one of guidance. Were it not for human weakness, self-interest, and perversity, human beings might have come to moral insight, truth, and action all by themselves. They should have been able to discern God's way, to come to full awareness of the intrinsically good moral order. But their acquired nature dulls their ability to do so. In his mercy, God helps persons to come to what their reason, were it not warped by their vices and circumstances, would have realized on its own. If the laws that Israel is supposed to follow were products of pure divine command and exclusive to Israel, they would be unintelligible to others, who would not be able to see the wisdom in Israel's laws or in its obedience to them. Thus, despite the surface invocation of divine commandment as the source of law, its deeper justification cannot be the mere fact of commandedness. There has to be a deep structure of reason that can become intelligible not only to Jews but to non-Jews as well. This view gets support from one of the greatest figures in Jewish history, Maimonides. Maimonides sought to discern and argued for the pervasive rationality of Jewish law. He criticized those who rejected the basis of divine law in reason as having a sickness in their souls. Quoting from Maimonides, whom traditional Jews don't call Maimonides, they call Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Moses the son of Maimon. There is a group of human beings who consider it a grievous thing that reasons should be given for any law. What would please them most is that the intellect would not find a meaning for the commandments and prohibitions. What compels them to feel this is a sickness that they find in their souls. For they think that if those laws were useful in this existence and had been given to us for this or that reason, it would be as if they derived from the reflection and the understanding of some intelligent person. If, however, there is a thing for which the intellect could not find any meaning at all, and that did not lead to something useful, it indubitably derives from God, for the reflection of man would not lead to such a thing. So Maimonides finds this view abhorrent. For Maimonides, a pure divine voluntarism in law and ethics would appear to us as capricious and irrationalism. our human, purposeful activity would appear rational, while divine activity would seem arbitrary. Man would be exalted above God, which would be perverse. For Maimonides, the entirety of the law is for our welfare, for our benefit. Law and ethics help to perfect us and raise us to metaphysical awareness and of even momentary communion with the ultimate. The idea of weak divine command theory fits better with the Jewish tradition than the strong version, but it is not yet clear whether we can call the normative structure of Judaism and ethics. I've been talking about law here, but hopefully this will become a little clearer soon. The next concern is particularity. The Jewish tradition, I argue, makes a strong claim for the underlying rationality of Jewish norms. This, in principle, supports the cross-cultural intelligibility of those norms, given a hermeneutics of charity. This stance is compatible with both the particularity of Judaism's normative practices and their universal translatability, at least in principle. Some commandments, like the two mentioned above, honoring of parents and love of neighbor, seem ethical on their face. Rabbinic Judaism will come to call these laws mishpatim, or statutes, laws that reason itself would command had they not been commanded by God. Others, such as not wearing garments of mixed cloths, like linen and wool, or only eating mammals that have split hooves and chew their cud, are more recondite. Rabbinic Judaism will call these chukim, ordinances, laws which puzzle reason and which the nations of the world mock. If all the commandments were mishpatim, Judaism would have been much more universal than it is. The chukim, which express covenantal specificity or intimacy, give Judaism its particularity, or rather, the interplay between the types of commandments gives Judaism its distinctive universal particular character. The biblical scholar John Levinson refers to this as the universal horizon of biblical particularism. There are two intellectual strategies within the tradition for analyzing and grounding the norms that sustain the healthy tension between the particular and the universal. The first is called Ta'amei HaMitzvot, the search for reasons for the commandments. Without the chukim, arguably, there would be no need to search for such reasons. The second strategy is called Sheva Mitzvot B'nei Noach, the 7 commandments of the sons of Noah, which establishes the functional equivalent of natural law. This is the strategy of discerning a fundamental level of normativity established by a covenant with Noah after the flood that stipulates basic moral norms for all human beings. The universal Noahide covenant precedes the particular Sinai covenant with Israel and remains in force as the moral framework for humanity. On account of it, righteousness is possible for non-Israelites. In rabbinic thought, Chasidei umot haolam yesh lahem chelek le'olam haba. The righteous among the nations have a share in the world to come. As to the Ta'amei HaMitzvot strategy, the reasons for the commandments, already in the Bible there is an appeal to what David Halivni calls justified law. Some laws have so-called motive clauses, which attribute a reason to the law and a motivation to follow it. Thus, the verse from the 10 Commandments, honor your father and your mother, continues, so that you may long endure on the land that the Lord your God is assigning to you. The willingness to associate laws with reasons is basic. Both individual laws and entire bodies of law are given rational contexts. In Leviticus, for example, laws with high ethical salience are prefaced by a rationale: speak to the whole Israelite community and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. The love your neighbor law is part of that corpus in Leviticus chapter 19. imitation of God's holiness, a concept that requires analysis, to be sure, motivates and justifies the law. Israel is to be a goy kadosh, a holy nation. Its laws conduce to holiness. Some ancient rabbis, like the contemporaries Maimonides criticizes, believed that the less than transparently rational laws had greater importance than the rational ones. On their view, the devotion of Jews to opaque laws shows their dedication to God, a kind of blind faith, more fully than their acceptance of rational ones. As the medieval philosopher Yehuda Halevi put it, glossing Plato, even a gang of robbers must have a kind of justice among them if their confederacy is to last. Rationally transparent laws are the fundamentals of any society, but for Halevi, like Heschel after him, the holy is higher than the good. The good laws, which establish basic justice, equity, and comity, subserve the particular divine laws, such as those of sacrificial offerings, the Sabbath, and circumcision, which were, quoting Halevi, especially given to Israel as a corollary to the rational laws. The practice of distinctive covenantal ordinances for Halevi brings a benefit beyond that of a decent society. It brings the descent of what the Bible calls the Holy Spirit, and for what Halevi calls the divine influence. Halevi is a zealous promoter of Jewish particularity. His reasoning about the commandments discerns a two-tier structure. The first tier, the law as a means of achieving a just society, is universal. The second tier, the communion of the Jewish prophet-like people, which he calls the heart of the nations, with God, is the teleological consummation of the law. Halevi endorses a shared social ethics and a sharply singular Jewish metaphysical destiny. Later Jewish thinkers who stress particularity sometimes follow Halevi in what is shared and what is separate. There are also those who take Halevi to an extreme and reject any commonality between Jews and non-Jews. This temptation is evident in the mystical tradition known as Kabbalah. Their conceptions of Jewish particularity often conflate a metaphysical vocation with a supposed biological uniqueness. The Jews become a kind of holy race with access to the divine that distinguishes them from others. Such views reflect centuries of persecution, ghettoization, and defensiveness. Getting the balance right between universalism and particularism, between, to put it another way, ethics and holiness, works out best in societies where Jews are treated fairly. There, the resources of Judaism for ethical relations with others can most fully emerge. These are more than sufficient to ground respect for neighbors and fellow citizens. Already half a millennium before the Common Era, the prophet Jeremiah counseled the Jews to understand that their welfare depends on the welfare of their non-Jewish peers in a shared civic space. Jeremiah taught, "Seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you and pray to the Lord in its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper." Where universal elements are discernible alongside the strong particularistic ones, it becomes most credible to speak of Jewish ethics. And I think in a society like, the democracies of Europe and North America and some other places where we speak of Jewish ethics, it's in part because of this social milieu in which we live. Getting a few pages from the end here, but I'm coming now to, I think, probably the most critical of these concerns that I raised, and that's the law and ethics problem. So, insofar as law plays a pivotal role in Judaism, what role is left for ethics? How are the two normative categories related? When Jews talk about the legal structure of their tradition, they use the term halakha, from a root meaning to walk, lalechet. Halakha, roughly the way that one should walk, is in fact broader than law. Although it is more than what we mean by law, as modern speakers of modern languages, it's not less than law. Traditional Jews are alert to this reality. Modern Jews, such as Lazarus or Cohen, transformed Judaism under pressures of European acculturation from a religion with halakha at its center to an ethics-oriented religion. More orthodox thinkers resisted and continue to resist the displacement of halakha. Before the law was revealed, what was the condition of human morality? Both the written Torah and the oral Torah presuppose a pre-revelatory natural morality. Abraham's dialogue with God about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah presumes a robust moral consciousness before the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. A passage of the Talmud famously says, if the Torah had not been given, we would have learned modesty from the cat, aversion to robbery from the ant, chastity from the dove, and conjugal manners from the rooster. The basic morality of the pre-Sinai world, as the rabbis understood it, was given in God's covenant with Noah, a kind of second Adam for the human race. The Torah builds on a musar tivi, a natural morality. The question then is, how does natural morality relate to revealed law? The main view is that the revelation at Sinai, that after the revelation at Sinai, halakha surpasses and displaces natural morality for Jews. Revelation institutes a stricter normative framework with far greater resources for understanding duty, rights, obligations, virtues, and other dimensions of conduct and character. In a sense, ethics, in scare quotes, as an independent domain becomes irrelevant. Halakha has become sufficient. Halakha, however, is not merely a collection of rules. It is a way of life worked out along legal lines. Real life situations do not correlate automatically with rules. People need to interpret what is salient, essential, determinative, and urgent in real life and work out how the legal rules might apply to it. This requires not just knowledge of the rules, but epistemic virtues, moral sensitivity, and hermeneutical prowess. Halakha is not a rule book, it is a path. It aims to shape moral personalities with minds capable of deciding how people should act in unique sets of circumstances. As such, halakha requires that one goes beyond strict simple rules and into interpretive territory that is illumined only through ethical sensitivity and discernment. The Talmud says that, quote, Jerusalem was destroyed because the inhabitants judged only according to Torah law. Now, that's really amazing, that Jerusalem was destroyed because the inhabitants only judged according to halakha. In the ensuing discussion, it turns out that they should have judged by a higher, supererogatory standard known as lifnim mishurat hadin, going beyond the line of the law, or literally staying within the line of the law. That is, not claiming everything you have a right to claim, but stopping short of going to a full exercise of your rights. This concept has to do with not taking all that one is legally entitled to take. It has to do with self-restraint, especially in the exercise of one's rights. It indicates an ethical dimension. So the law, we might say, sets a floor, but not a ceiling. Lifnim mishurat hadin indicates a ceiling, a height toward which observance of rules and norms ought to aspire. But here's the problem. It's not quite right to see this as supererogation, some sort of ethical dimension above and beyond the law. Because, in fact, it is expected of pious Jews that they will always act lifnim mishurat hadin. Thus, the Orthodox scholar Aaron Lichtenstein wrote, halakha itself mandates that we go beyond its legal corpus. Lichtenstein continues, The fact is that the halakha is multiplanar and many-dimensional. Properly conceived, it includes much more than is explicitly required or permitted by specific rules. And thus, we shall realize that the ethical moment we are seeking is itself an aspect of halakha. So you see how strong the drive is among contemporary Orthodox scholars to sort of pull everything that could pass for ethics back into this kind of, under this legal umbrella. That's a clear illustration of why some Orthodox thinkers reject the independence of Jewish ethics as a substantive category without really rejecting the ethical. So finally, the worry about an independent, rationally justifiable, or at least rationally explicable ethics as a framework for Jewish existence is also a worry about Jewish survival. If Judaism is all about ethics, then the way of life founded on mitzvot, in all their irreducible particularity, recedes. Ethics as a concept becomes a kind of boundary marker for Jewish identity. If ethics as an identity marker does too much work, the mitzvot, the commandments, it is feared, will do too little. A hint of this can be found in the classic commentary of the Italian scholar Rabbi Ovadia Bartonuro, who dies in 1516, to Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot, loosely translated as the chapters of the Fathers, is the only treatise in the fundamental work of oral Torah, the Mishnah, that deals solely with ostensibly ethical matters. Bartonuro wonders why such a treatise was included by the rabbis in the Mishnah. His answer makes the moral teachings and principles of the tractate very much like the laws that fill the other tractates. They too come from Sinai. So the first statement of Mishnah Pirkei Avot, Moses received Torah from Sinai. Bartonuro comments, I say that since this treatise is not a commentary on a biblical commandment, like the other treatises of the Mishnah, but a series of ethical principles, and since the sages of the world have also written books where they invented rules to guide human beings in their behavior toward their fellows, the rabbi begins his treatise by saying Moses received Torah from Sinai, to tell you that the ethical principles in this treatise were not a fabrication of the Mishnaic sages, but they too come from Sinai. So Bartonuro is concerned to distinguish this ancient collection of wisdom sayings and aphorisms from comparable material in world literature. Not to do so would, in his eyes, diminish the Torah and lower the barriers between Jews and Gentiles. Whatever sense that made in the medieval or Renaissance world, it is much harder and much less desirable to justify today. I've tried to show that there are genuine methodological problems with the term Jewish ethics. But if we are aware of these problems, the term needn't be a stumbling block in the path of the rich, complex moral teaching that inheres in the Jewish tradition. Discerning and building a Jewish ethics and contributing its voice to the human moral conversation is the welcome task of recent generations of Jewish moral philosophers and theologians. Thank you.